In today's video, I'll be doing a walkthrough of the writing section from SAT Practice Test 9. I've scored perfectly on back-to-back SAT writing sections, and as I go through this practice test, I'm going to show you the most efficient way to answer each and every question. And along the way, I'll give you some tips, tricks, and grammar rules that you need to know for the SAT writing section. So with all that being said, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get started. So we have survival in the hostile environment of NW Rhodea 1. So immediately I see I have a 1 at the beginning of my paragraph, so I'm going to go find the question that tells me what sentence I have to place. I see that's going to be sentence 5 from question 2, so I'm going to go ahead and find sentence 5, see what should come before it and what should come after it. So we have at that depth. That's telling me I have to discuss some sort of depth in the sentence before sentence 5, wherever I end up placing it. Then I have water pressure suppresses the explosive force of the volcano's eruptions, allowing scientists to watch and observe them up close. Well, watch and observe mean the same thing, so I'm going to have to get rid of one of those. If I go up to my answer choices for 1, I see observe to see. Observe and see mean the same thing. Visually and watch mean the same thing. Therefore, my answer there's got to be answer choice B, because that is the answer choice that avoids repetition and redundancy. But long story short, when placing sentence 5, I'm looking for a depth to come before it, and then after it, I'd be looking for some sort of discussion potentially about remotely operated vehicles. All right, so let's go ahead and start reading through. We have 60 miles north of Guam and more than 1,700 feet under the ocean's surface. That's a depth right there. Is the summit of NW Rhodea 1, an undersea volcano discovered in 2003. Surprisingly, the volcano appears to have been continuously active. It even grew 130 feet in height between 2006 and 2009. Now, like I said, I need a depth to come before where I place sentence 5. I'm going to see if there's any other depths listed in this paragraph. If there's not, then I'm going to have to place sentence 5 after sentence 1. Yet, despite the hostile environment created by the constant volcanic activity, life is thriving there. Special adaptations are the key to survival. Okay, I see that there's no other discussions of depth, therefore sentence 5 must come after sentence 1. So my answer for number 2 will be answer choice B. All right, moving on, we got NW Rhodea 1 is far below the ocean's photic zone where sunlight drives photosynthesis. Then we have some sort of transition word here. Bacteria supporting a unique food web have adapted to this perpetually dark environment. Well, we see that they can't use photosynthesis, which would indicate that you have some sort of disadvantage in generating food, right? And then at the same time, we see bacteria have adapted, right? So this is telling us that in spite of them not being able to use photosynthesis, they are able to survive, right? And in fact, create their own food web, so maybe even thrive. Right? So we see that that's in spite of something else. Therefore, the transition word that we'd use to show something is in spite of something else would be nevertheless. Okay, we wouldn't use afterward because it's not coming after something else. It's not furthermore because we're not adding it to something else. And it's also not going to be similarly because it's not similar to something else. Now we have the bacteria have evolved to use hydrogen sulfide instead of sunlight for the energy that drives their metabolic processes, and hydrothermal venting is the source of the chemical soup necessary to support him or her. No, we know it has to be them. How do we know it has to be them? Well, we know that it's their metabolic process. Okay, we're referring to the bacteria plural. Okay, and since it's plural, we know that we have to have them. We can't have him, her, can't have one, can't have it. It's got to be them. Okay, because we had their metabolic processes. All right, now we have seawater seeping into fissures in the ocean floor is heated by underlying magma, and the heat drives chemical reactions that remove oxygen, sulfates, and remove other chemicals. No, we already said remove. Remove is being applied to oxygen, it's being applied to sulfates, and it's being applied to other chemicals. Okay, we don't have to say remove again. We've already said it once. We can get rid of remove, and we can just say and. We don't have to repeat remove. We can get rid of A, B, and C because they're all repetitive and redundant. All right, moving on, we got once the superheated water up to 750 degrees Fahrenheit rises through vents in the ocean floor, additional reactions cause minerals and compounds to precipitate onto the sea floor where bacteria feed on them. All right, low-heat shrimp originally thought to exist around an undersea volcano near Hawaii. One thing that should jump out to you immediately when you saw this is you got an M dash, right? What is an M dash when it's not being used at the end of an independent clause indicating to you? It's probably going to be a non-essential phrase or clause. In this case, we see it is a non-essential phrase or clause. How do we know that? Well, if we took out everything that I'm going to highlight here, so everything between the M dash and whatever punctuation we put after Hawaii, the sentence would still make sense. We'd have low-heat shrimp survive by using tiny shear-like claws to harvest rapidly growing bacterial filaments covering rocks near NW1's hydrothermal vents. So as we can see, we could take out everything highlighted there, and we know that we have to have an M dash after Hawaii since that's what we started the non-essential phrase or clause with. Therefore, our answer there has got to be C for number 6. All right, next we have the low-heat shrimp spend most of their time grazing on the bacteria and evading another previously unknown species of shrimp. Shrimp of that species also graze on bacterial filaments as juveniles. Now we're asked, which choice most effectively sets up the information in the next sentence? Well, what's the information in the next sentence? We have to read on. They feed on the low-heat shrimp. Okay, keep in mind that that's a contrast from when they were juveniles and they fed on bacterial filaments and other organisms that are overcome by the toxic plumes of volcanic gas and ash. If I want to set this up, I got to indicate a contrast in, the food that they're eating, some sort of transition there. So I have option A, resulting from their ability to cope with the noxious environment around the volcano. Well, somehow we got to sort of transition into them being able to now eat actual, low low heat shrimp, right? So they're being predators now rather than just eating bacterial filaments. So we can get rid of A. It's not indicating any sort of transition like that. Option B, their adaptations are not yet fully understood by the scientific community. That's not showing us how they're now able to feed on shrimp rather than bacterial filaments. Option C, thriving in an unusual ecosystem that also includes crabs, limpets, and barnacles. Once again, that's not telling us how they're making this transition into what they're eating. Option D, but as adults, okay, now we're indicating that transition from when they were juveniles. Their claws are large enough for the shrimp to be predators, thus they can now feed on other shrimp. Right, so we see then, now that we have that transition between when they were juveniles, where they were just eating bacterial filaments, now they're predators, answer choice D. That's effectively setting up the information in the next sentence. Keep in mind, that's what you need to do here, is set up that information in that next sentence. Make sure you pay close attention to that part of that prompt. All right, moving on, now we got number 8. So during an underwater eruption, steam quickly condenses, and then we repeat the word, the steam. We don't want to repeat the steam because we already said it once, so any answer choice that repeats the steam, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of. Okay, I see that obviously none of them do, okay? But if we take a look at A through D then, we've got condenses and leaves. Condenses having to leave, that's wordy. We don't need to say having to. We can just say condenses and leaves. Condenses there after leaving, don't have to say thereafter. Okay, we can go ahead and get rid of C. Condenses and then after this, well, that's very, very repetitive and redundant. We can get rid of D as well. We want to be as concise as possible, especially when combining sentences. So if you're ever asked to combine sentences, make sure that you're looking to be concise. All right, next we have, this means that the water near NW Rhodea 1 is more acidic than that of stomach acid? No, okay? Why is it not that of stomach acid? Well, we know that we're comparing the water near NW Rhodea 1. If we're comparing water to something else that's acidic, we would just compare it to the stomach acid. There's nothing to put in front, okay? We're comparing like things. If we're comparing water to stomach acid, we're comparing two liquids. We don't have to put anything in front of that. We don't have to say the acid from stomach acid. We can just say, then stomach acid. We can just make that comparison because they're both liquids. All right, and then we have presenting yet another challenge to life forms living nearby. As the carbon dioxide level in Earth's atmosphere rises, the world's oceans. Okay, oceans doesn't own anything here. So anything with an apostrophe with oceans, we can get rid of. So we see we can get rid of A, we can get rid of B. Now, worlds. Worlds does own the oceans, but keep in mind there's only one world. Okay, so that apostrophe has to come between the D and the S. So our answer for 10 will be C. All right, absorb. The world's oceans absorb more carbon dioxide. I'm assuming we're going to be asked about adding something. I see that we are, which increases their acidity. Would we want to add this? Yes, and I'll go ahead and show you why. The whole point of this paragraph, right? We see that we're talking about acidity near NW Rhodea 1, in this zone, right, that we've got. So it's really focusing in on acidity, talking about how as carbon dioxide levels increase, the world's oceans absorb more carbon dioxide. We need to connect this back to acidity then. That's why we want to add that. Okay, so what does that mean? Yes, because it's explaining the relevance of the sentence to the point made in the paragraph, that point in the paragraph being the acidity of the world's oceans. We have option B, yes, because it helps the reader understand why organisms near NW Rhodea 1 evolved the way they did. No, that doesn't tell us about their evolution, but it does tell us about how the oceans are increasing in acidity because of that increase in carbon dioxide. So it tells us why it's relevant here. Then we have answered all of the questions in this passage, so we don't even have to read to the end. Okay, that's an important thing to recognize. Once you've answered all the questions in a passage, you can go ahead and stop reading. We don't have to read anything right here. We just ignore that, we move on. All right, now we got free public transportation. City planners concerned about vehicle traffic clogging their city's roadways are trying to find ways to get people out of their cars and onto buses and trains. One radical proposal some planners have considered is to make public transportation free to passengers. While fare-free policies do increase ridership, have to have a comma there. Why? Because we have a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence. How do I know that? Well, we have a subordinated conjunction of well starting off our sentence. That's an indicator. Okay, and then after that dependent clause, we have to have that comma, like I said. So we're asked in 12, looks like we just have options. Okay, we can't use a semicolon because it's a dependent clause. Looking at options A, B, and C, looks like we're going to have potentially a comma splice in C. I'm going to go ahead and see, we can't have a comma splice. This is a dependent clause before the comma, so we can't have a comma splice. That's my bad, I misspoke. But we have welfare-free policies do increase ridership, and then we have they have not been found to be an effective way to address traffic problems. Okay. In this case, we obviously see that that's going to be an independent clause. We don't have to connect it with a fanboy because of the dependent clause. So we don't need and, we don't need but. And we see our correct answer there is going to be C. We just take our dependent clause, put it in, put a comma at the end of it since it's at the beginning of the sentence, and then get straight into our independent clause from there. So answer choice C is perfect there. Looking at 13, which choice is the most effective version of the underlined portion? Well, let's go ahead and read to it. So we have moreover, these policies may result in serious budget shortfalls, not surprisingly. We have public transportation is used by more people when people do not have to pay a fare. I don't want to repeat the word people twice. A is incorrect. Looking at B, more people use public transportation if they do not have to pay a fare. Yep, that looks perfect to me. Nothing wrong grammatically. It's efficient, it's concise, looks good. If we take a look at C, I'll go ahead and show you why C and D are wrong as well. We have if people do not have to pay a fare, more of those people use public transportation. Once again, we don't want to repeat the word people twice. Looking at D, using public transportation is done by more people when they do not have to pay a fare. Saying is done and using means the same thing. I'd have to get rid of one of those, therefore D is incorrect. It's not concise enough. Looking at number 14 now. That's all the way down. So let's go ahead and read down there. We have, according to a report by the Center for Urban Transportation Research, public transit systems that abolish fares typically see a short-term increase in ridership of about 50%. However, this increase does not necessarily correlate with a decrease in car traffic. Evidence suggests that when buses and subways are free, people often take bus and train trips they would not have otherwise taken while still using their cars nearly as much as they did before. In 2013, Tallinn, Estonia instituted fare-free rides for city residents, becoming the largest city in the world to do so. But car use in Tallinn has only slightly declined. And then we have, as a 2014 study by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden found that car traffic in Tallinn was down less than 3%. Since it was enacted, well, we don't know what it's referring to. We don't know what that would be referring to. We don't know what one would be referring to. Therefore, we have to say the policy so we know exactly what we're referring to there. Okay, so our answer there's got to be D. Now, going back to 14, what do we recognize here? Well, we got an independent clause right here in 2013, Tallinn, Estonia instituted fare-free rides for city residents, becoming the largest city in the world to do so. Right, we have an independent clause there. Now, keep in mind, after that, we have, but car use in Tallinn has only slightly declined. Okay, and then after that, we have, as a 2014 study by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden found car traffic was down less than 3%. Okay, this is another independent clause here. Okay, when we say car traffic in Tallinn was down less than 3%, that's an independent clause. I'll go ahead and highlight that. So you see we have two independent clauses that we have to connect here. How are we going to connect two independent clauses? Well, in this case, we need to pay attention to the relationship between them. Okay, if our second independent clause is explaining or illustrating the idea in our first, as this one is, where we say car use in Tallinn has only slightly declined. Okay, keep in mind that that's an independent clause as well, right? Car use in Tallinn has only slightly declined. We're illustrating that in this next independent clause. So if we're going to connect two independent clauses where the second is illustrating the idea in the first, we connect them with a colon. Therefore, our answer for 14 has to be answer choice B. All right, moving on, we got instituting a fare-free system can also have a devastating effect on a transportation budget. We're asked for which choice introduces the paragraph, which means we need to read on. All public transportation systems are subsidized by the government to some extent, but large systems gain a substantial portion of their operating revenues from fares. Since systems that go fare-free see increases in ridership, they often must operate more buses and trains and hire more drivers and other personnel. At the same time, they are losing a key source of funding. Okay, so what do we see here? Well, we see that the fare-free system is significantly decreasing the funding for transportation. At the same time, demand is going up, thus having a devastating effect on the city's transportation budget. Okay, so that would be answer choice A. Okay, we're not talking about requiring planners to make careful considerations about changes in service. We want to focus in on this economic impact here. C might also have a negative impact on the environment as more service is added. No. D also has the drawback of increasing crowding on public transportation. The only reason that we would care about crowding is just the fact that it means that we have increased costs. That's it. All right. Now looking at question 17. We have advocates of fare-free policies claim that the cost of these policies are largely offset by various savings. Now we'll have some sort of transition word. Oh, looks like we're going to have some sort of variances in punctuation here. Okay. Well, advocates of fare-free policies claim that the cost of these policies are largely offset by various savings. That's an independent clause. After this, we have a recent study comparing projected results of fare-free policies in different cities found this outlook to be way too sunny. That's another independent clause. Also, we can go ahead and answer 18 really quick. Okay, way too sunny. That's not fitting the tone of our passage. The tone of our passage is academic. Okay, looking at answer choice B, looking too much on the bright side. That's very wordy. Also, not maintaining the same tone as our passage. Option C, pretty upbeat. That's closer, but still too casual. Answer choice D, overly optimistic. That fits the academic tone of our passage. That'll be our correct answer there. All right, looking at number 17 now. What did we find out? Well, we found out we had two independent clauses, right, as we went through there. Therefore, we can't connect them with only a comma. We can't connect them with commas with however, right? There's not one of the fanboys there, so we can get rid of A and B. We're looking at C and we're looking at D. We got this comma with a but, okay, versus the semicolon with an and. I can go ahead and get rid of D because I know that we're not going to use a semicolon with an and, okay? That's kind of a red flag. You don't want to do that. If you're going to, connect two independent clauses with an and, you'd use a comma, not a semicolon. So I know my answer is going to be C there, and I'm going to go ahead and show you why they used but as well. Okay, in this case, we're going to be more than likely contrasting, so I'll go ahead and show you this. We have advocates of fare-free policies claiming costs are largely offset by various savings, comma, but now we're providing the contrast of a recent study found that outlook to be overly optimistic. So that's providing that contrast there that supports answer choice C as well. All right, let's go ahead and keep reading. Public transit was projected to save $8.4 million per year in fare collection costs. Now we're told the writer wants to provide an accurate interpretation of the chart, or which choice provides an accurate interpretation of the chart. So we're going to go to the chart, right? We see that we pretty much have complete control as far as what we're dealing with here. The only restriction that we have is that we're talking about San Francisco, California. Okay, so that's telling me when I go to my chart, I'm going to go ahead and highlight the row that I'm looking at. I'm really only concerned with this row because I know I'm limited to San Francisco, California. Now, if one of my answer choices tells me different, then I'll have to reevaluate that. But I see that they don't here. Okay, so my option A, create a deficit of 72 million per year in lost fares. Let me look at cost and lost fares. I see it's 112, not 72. A is incorrect. B, save an additional $112 million from lost fares. I see I have cost and lost fares, and that's 112 million. So I'm not saving 112 million, it's costing me that. C, but result in a total increase of $184 million per year in operating costs. I see I have a total additional operating cost, which would be an increase in operating costs of 184 million. C is correct, it's accurate according to the chart. I'll go and show you why D is incorrect as well. It says save 72 per million. Save $72 million per year in costs related to adding the service. No, that $72 million per year is a cost. It's not savings. All right, next we have on top of capital investments in new equipment and infrastructure. Now the writer is considering adding the following sentence based on the information in the chart. By contrast, Lane Transit in Eugene, Oregon would lose only $5 million in fares if it instituted a fare-free system. Should the writer make this addition here? Well, what do we know about this paragraph? We know that this paragraph is talking about how fare-free systems have devastating impacts on a city's transportation budget, right? That's our main claim of this paragraph. So why would we want to include something that counters that? We wouldn't, okay? We don't want to include this because it's running counter to what our whole paragraph has proven, okay? So we have option A, yes, because it improves, or I'm sorry, obviously we're not going to add it, so I'll go ahead and go through these. No, because it does not support the argument that fare-free systems cause a substantial loss for governments. Yes, that's perfect, it's right on. Answer choice D, no, because it contradicts a point about fare collection made earlier in the paragraph. No, we want to focus on the fact that it doesn't support our argument that it causes a substantial loss for governments. All right, moving on to 21 and 22, we have, this is not to say that fare-free public transportation is always a bad idea. Some college towns and resort communities embrace the model because buses can go faster when drivers would not have had to collect fares. No, it would be when drivers do not have to, okay? When they do not have to collect fares. How do we know this? Well, for one, it matches can go, okay? We got to match the tense there, and that's how we know this, okay? In this case, we are looking at, I believe, the present indicative, right? We have the present indicative of do not have matches in with this present tense of can go, okay? All our other answer choices are in the wrong tense. That's how we know for 21 our answer choice has to be answer choice B. Okay, when we match that present tense from can go. Can go is telling us our answer for 21. Now we have 4 large cities looking to reduce automobile traffic, though. And now we're told which choice provides the best conclusion to the passage. Make sure that you're focusing on the passage overall, not just the last paragraph. Make sure that you do that. We have option A. Research about Tallinn, Estonia could be instructive. Tallinn, Estonia is not the main point of the passage, so that's incorrect. Option B. Subways will prove more important than buses, not the main point of the passage. We want to focus on fare-free public transportation. Option C. Public transportation should be cheaper but not free, not the main point of the passage. We are arguing completely against fare-free public transportation. Okay, we're saying it's not the answer, so our answer for 22 would be D. All right, moving on to passage 3. Wetplate photography, an old technique, makes a new splash. I see I have a 1 out in front of my paragraph, so I'm going to go ahead and find the sentence I have to place. I see that's in question 24. So the writer plans to add the following sentences to this paragraph. Why wouldn't they? To make the paragraph most logical, the sentence should be placed where? Well, I'm going to want some sort of explanation, more than likely, after this question mark, whether that's in the next paragraph or within this paragraph. And then as far as what should come before, it's a little bit tough to know just because this is so short, of a sentence. So let's go ahead and just start reading through. We should be able to find a place to put it as we go through. So we have, upon the arrival of the digital camera, professional photographers harumphed that, and they'll have some sort of pronoun, produced ugly, low-resolution images. Well, that's referring to the digital camera, which is singular. Okay, therefore, our answer has to be it. It can't be they is plural. Can't be he or she because we're referring to an object, and it wouldn't be one. We want to say it because we're referring to that digital camera. We want to use the singular pronoun for an object, which would be it. All right, moving on. We have, eventually the vast majority of them traded film for megapixels. All right, so this is indicating an action here. And then we have the latest digital cameras take pictures so crisp that the images in them appear to be die cut. Okay, so the big thing that we're seeing here, we are now explaining the action that came before, right? So we have sentence 3, and ultimately what we're doing is we're explaining why they decided to make that decision in sentence 2 of trading in film for megapixels. Okay, so we are now going to put in why wouldn't they then between sentences 2 and 3, because then we go in from action to why wouldn't they to explanation of why they chose to do that. So it makes sense then to put why wouldn't they between sentences 2 and 3, which means our answer for 24 will be answer choice B. All right, then we have, even today's humblest smartphones snap bright, sharp photos. A few contemporary photographers, however, have embraced an anachronistic method that was state-of-the-art technology when it was invented in 1551, wet plate photography. Wet plate photographers essentially create their own film. The process can be dangerous given that it requires the use of several volatile chemicals. Then we have the writers considering adding the following sentence. It's also labor-intensive, involving several intricate steps. Should the writer make this addition here? Well, we need to read on to figure this out. We have to take a wet plate photograph. Photographers usually first arrange or pose, and that has to be their subject. How do I know that? Well, we're referring to the photographer's subject. Photographers is plural, and they own their subjects. Therefore, we should have THEIR. Okay, so our answer there will be D. All right, before mixing a collodion, a viscous, light-sensitive chemical solution with bromide, iodide, or chloride, and applying the mixture to a clean, polished glass plate. Dried collodion is unusable, and then we'll have some sort of transition there. Keep in mind that what we just had there was an independent clause. Once the photo is snapped with a massive tripod-mounted camera, the photographer has, and then we'll have something there, minutes to develop it using more chemicals. That's another independent clause. We're connecting two independent clauses together. Keep in mind that our second one is exhibiting a causal relationship to the first independent clause, right? Because dried collodion is unusable, once the photo is snapped, the photographer has to quickly take action. So this is a causal relationship, so we would use the word so for one of the fanboys to connect those two independent clauses with that comma. So our answer for 27 will be A. Now going back to 25 a minute, okay, should we add in that it's labor intensive involving several intricate steps? Well, what we're ultimately seeing is that we are illustrating these steps that it takes, right? We have when the image appears in the negative, water is used to stop the process, chemical fixed bath turns the negative image into a positive one. So we're describing that process. Should we add this? Yes. Why? Because it sets up the paragraph's outline of the process of wet plate photography. Okay, we're not serving as an effective transition by reiterating the main idea of the previous paragraph. We're setting up this current paragraph and that outline of the process that we're making throughout the rest of this paragraph. So answer for 25 would be answer choice B. Moving on, we got our answer for number 28. Okay, so right here, has nominal minutes? Well, the writer wants to emphasize how quickly the wet plate photographers have to work. Which choice is accomplishing this goal? Well, we would say not nominal minutes, because that's not focusing on how quick they have to take this action. And then we're between a few, a matter of, and a mere. Okay, if you say that someone has mere minutes to do something, it's showing the emphasis on how quickly they have to get this done because there's some deadline before something happens. Okay, saying a few or a matter of isn't focusing in on how quickly you have to get something done before a deadline. We want to make sure that we're taking that into account. And in this case, mere is ultimately what's really emphasizing how quickly the photographer has to take action. So our answer for our answer for question 8 will be answer choice D. All right, then we have when the image appears in the negative, water is used to stop the process. A chemical fixed bath turns the negative image into a positive one. The photo is then immersed in water and warmed. Now we have a transition there. It is coated with lavender oil to give it a protective finish. Okay, we don't need any sort of punctuation in 30. We just want to say oil to give it a protective finish. This is just testing that you know not to toss in random punctuation anywhere. All right, and then we got 29. As far as the transition there, we are describing our final step in this sentence here. Since we're describing that final step and what I just highlighted, we would use finally as our transition there because we just listed out a series of steps and this is the last one. All right, moving on to number 31. Wet plate photos are marvelously fine-grained and detailed, and they seem to glow with an ethereal, silvery light. One misstep or a speck of dust in the glass plate, though, and flaws appear. Smudges resembling oyster shells swirl, and it looks like we just are dealing with tense and number of our verb here, around the photo's edges. So if we're dealing with tense here, which it looks like we are, it looks like all of these have different tenses, which they do. So we can go ahead and find our correct tense. So I'm going to look for verbs that'll indicate to me what my tense is. I see I have appear, that's present tense. I'll go ahead and read on. Sunbursts or streaks emerge, also present tense. Where collodion pools unevenly. Therefore, I want swirl to be present tense, which it is, so I'm not going to change anything. I got to keep it in the present tense. All these other answer choices are not in the present tense, or at least not in the simple present tense. All right, then we have since the film requires long exposures, moving subjects blur. We have a shifting arm or leg might even disappear because of the lengthy exposure time. Well, we already said that it requires long exposures, so any answer choice that repeats that, I'm going to get rid of. So I can get rid of A. Looking at B, I see I also have long exposure time in there. I can get rid of B because it has that. Looking at answer choice C, once again, has the long exposure time. I already know that. So if I'm going to restate that, I'm being repetitive and redundant, which means I would get it wrong. Therefore, my answer has to be D because that avoids repetition and it avoids redundancy. Moving on, the exposure time required explains why people in wet plate photographs often look dour. It's hard to hold a smile for that long. Prominent among contemporary wet plate photographers is Joni Sternbach, whose work centers appropriately on water and people's relationship to it. Sternbach's photo series, Ocean Details, Sea Sky, and Surfland depict surging surfs, roiling waves, and the surfers who ride them. It says the writer wants to highlight the contrast between Sternbach's techniques and the people Sternbach photographs. Which choice most effectively accomplishes this goal? Well, what's the contrast going to be there? We can look through the answer choices to find out. I feel like I have a good idea, but I want to use these answer choices to sort of show you some stuff as far as how you can use them to your advantage. So we have her subjects could be 19th century wave riders, if not for the modern board shorts and bikinis they wear. So in this case, we see that we're obviously contrasting time there, right? Which is a contrast of the methods she is using to photograph them and the people she's actually photographing. Okay, so that's the contrast there. So A will be our correct answer, but I also want to show you why B through D are incorrect here. So we have option B, subjects of her photos could be ordinary people if not for the modern board shorts and bikinis they wear. Ordinary people wear modern stuff all the time, so B is incorrect. No contrast there. C, it would be hard to tell her subjects are surfers if not for the modern board shorts and bikinis they wear. There's no contrast there either. And then D, they would appear to come from all walks of life if not for the modern board shorts and bikinis they wear. People from all walks of life do wear that stuff, so that really doesn't make sense either. All right, moving on. I believe that we are on next. Yep, so we don't have to read any more after that. Keep that in mind. Make sure you know when to stop reading. All right, now we got digging up cities. In 2010, as a construction crew began to tear up sidewalks in New York City's South Street Seaport to replace a water pipe, Alyssa Lura and her team watched eagerly, picks and brushes in hand. Rhodea, an urban archaeologist, studies the history of cities. Now we're told the writer is considering revising the portion to the following: cities by excavating artifacts that have accumulated over centuries of land development. Should the writer make this revision here? I want to get some more context before I answer that, so I'm going to just read on a little bit, and that's some advice I have for you as well. And then we have any New York City construction project using municipal funds. This has to be is required. How do I know it has to be is? Well, it has to be singular. How do I know it's got to be singular? Well, I know I'm referring to any New York City construction project. Construction project, singular, therefore verb has to be singular. Answer there has to be is. All right, moving on, we got is required to consider whether historical artifacts will be affected during construction, and if that possibility exists or is possible. I can just say exists. I don't need to say is possible. Don't need to say potentially. Both of those are repetitive and redundant. Then we have exists. It is necessary. Well, we already have must be consulted at the end here, okay? So in that case, we don't need to have necessary. If that possibility exists, an urban archaeologist must be consulted. We don't need to say necessary. That's repetitive and redundant. Answer there will be D for number 36. Since the South Street Seaport was a bustling commercial center for early colonists, Rhodea anticipated that its rich history lay beneath the pavement. Our job to document and recover that history before it's lost. Now keep in mind, you could really probably answer 34 now, but I think that is also important to get some more context, just to sort of illustrate to you why you need more context. I'll explain that more later. But as the work continued, we have some sort of transition here. The team faced obstacles. Now, in this case, it's not a causal relationship, right? It's not because the work continued that they faced obstacles, therefore we can't use therefore. It's not at the same time, and it's not similar to anything. It's not like something else. In this case, we would use though, right? As the work continued, though, the team faced obstacles. Now, next up, we got 38. So field work in a city has to be done intermittently. The construction crew had to proceed one block at a time to avoid interrupting traffic, and the archaeologist team's work was periodically halted by stormy weather and the discovery of toxic materials underground. Keep in mind, we don't need to have any punctuation there, okay? We would just use answer choice D as our correct answer, right? It was periodically halted by stormy weather. No need for any punctuation there, okay? Make sure that you're not just tossing in random punctuation on the SAT because you will end up getting some of those questions wrong. All right, next up, number 39, and then we'll go back up and we'll answer that question that we skipped over. So we have moreover, as archaeologists underground attempted to relay information to those at the surface, they had to contend with the noise of construction vehicles, car horns, and pedestrians' noise. This noise applies to the construction vehicles, it applies to the car horns, it applies to the pedestrians. We don't have to say noise again. So therefore we can get rid of answer choice A, we can get rid of answer choice B. We don't have to say that of pedestrians, we can just say pedestrians to maintain that parallelism with car horns and construction vehicles. All right, on the busy New York City streets. Now, like I said, we can go back up here now. We can answer question 34, right? So as we can see, ultimately what's happening is they're excavating these artifacts that have accumulated over centuries of land development. We talk about them going underneath the road in order to cultivate these artifacts. So obviously we can see that we want to add this. Why? Well, that's because it's setting up the rest of the passage, which is explaining what urban archaeologists do, right? This whole passage is really about what they do, so we want to make sure we explain that initially so that our readers aren't confused as they read on. So our answer there would be A. If we take a look at B, it says yes because it identifies characteristics that make particular cities worthy of archaeology study. We're not focused on which particular cities are worthy, we're focused on just explaining what urban archaeologists do there. That way the audience is not confused throughout the rest of this passage. All right, despite these setbacks, Rhodea and her team eventually began to uncover some interesting artifacts. In 2012, the team discovered a foundation wall, a network of wooden pipes, and several well bases dating to the 18th century. In August 2013, the archaeologists discovered thousands of objects in a single 15-foot stretch that was likely a garbage disposal site. Next, we see in all our answer choices, pretty similar wording, just dealing with difference in punctuations. We have to read on here, including buttons from Revolutionary War uniforms, clay pipes, and an imported mineral water bottle from Germany. All right, well, what is this here right now as it stands just from... I'm going to go ahead and highlight this because you can see what I'm referring to. Let's go ahead and get that. Okay, from here to here, this is all a participle phrase. Okay, everything highlighted. How do I know that? Well, we're starting with the participle included, okay, and we're just describing everything that was found within this garbage disposal site. Now, if we have a participle phrase connecting it back to an independent clause, what we can do is we can just put a comma between it. Okay, so our answer here is going to be C. We can't put a semicolon because what's coming after is a participle phrase. We don't want to put a comma and then add among these were because that's going to create a comma splice. And then looking at answer choice A, we can't have a participle phrase as its own sentence. So if you have a participle phrase, which is fairly easy to recognize because it'll say something like including or, including is really the main one. That's how you can kind of recognize it. And then it'll also pretty much always end in an ing as well. So that's another indicator for you. But what you want to do then to connect that to the independent clause is put a comma, and then you can go ahead and get straight into that participle phrase. So our answer for 40 would be C. All right, moving on to number 41. Which choice most effectively sets up the example discussed in the following sentence? So let's keep reading on. As they cleaned and cataloged the artifacts, archaeologists took stock of their findings. The team's discoveries provided a snapshot of the various kinds of construction materials that were used in the 18th century. All right, so our options here to set up the example in the following sentence, we got to keep reading on then to find that example. Colonial area New Yorkers went to great lengths to secure fresh drinking water, Rhodea noted, given the effort involved in laying wooden pipes to bring in fresh water from surrounding areas. Digging very deep wells, brewing alcohol to mask the water's salty taste, and even importing bottled water. All right, well, what do we see in 42? We'll quick answer that before we come back to 41. What choice is best maintaining the style and tone? That's going to be effort. Okay, blood, sweat, and tears, too casual, too much sort of slang. Same thing with hassle. Okay, we want to make sure we're maintaining this academic tone that has been developed throughout the course of this passage. And then feats of strength and fortitude, not only is that wordy, but it's also, once again, a little bit more on the casual side, not really fitting in with this academic tone that has good diction. All right, and then moving up to 41 now. All right, so to set up this example, obviously what we're talking about then is things dealing with how the city, was made years ago, how underlying infrastructure, in particular water, right? How water pipes were made. So sort of like industrials, we want to focus in on that. So we have option A, the various kinds of construction materials that were used in the 18th century. We're not so much focused on materials as we are how they're implemented. And then we look at option B, the numerous rituals associated with hospitality. No, we're not focused on rituals there. Option C, public utility planning, right? Those sort of industrials, water, how the pipes are oriented, things like that, and infrastructure development. Yep. So that's right on kind of focusing on those industrial aspect of the city, how things were implemented to get water different places, sewage, things like that. And then option D, how major construction projects were financed. We're not concerned with their financing. That's what's making D incorrect there. All right, moving on, we've got questions 43 and 44. Through such discoveries, we're going to have someone here. It's unclear who they is referring to, especially since it's the start of a new paragraph, so we can get rid of that. Unclear who we is referring to. We know that it's not colonial area New Yorkers here, right? Because if we read on, we see tell the story of a city's history. Who's doing that? Urban archaeologists are in a new way. And then we have 44. The writer wants to conclude the passage with a quotation from Rhodea that illustrates the broad impact of her team's work. Which choice most effectively accomplishes this goal? Well, ultimately what we're looking for here is to, obviously illustrate that broad impact of our team's work. Anytime you're given a prompt on the SAT writing section, you want to pay close attention to what it's asking you to do. So we got to make sure we're not focusing too narrow, okay? We got to stay broad here on the impact. So you have option A, one of my favorite things is putting together someone's life. No, that's too specific. Option B, New York City construction has a lot of stops and starts. Irrelevant. C, finding the bits and pieces that were actually used by the people in the past makes New York City's history real. Yes, okay, that's right on. It's showing the broader impact. Okay, it's not too focused in on one part. Then we look at option D, we call our archaeological technique monitoring. That's not focusing on the broader impact at all. Okay, that's focusing on some specific technique, so that's really way off. Hopefully this video is helpful. If it was, make sure to like and subscribe. In addition to that, if you're looking to donate or if you're looking for my website where I offer private SAT prep, college essay brainstorming, and college essay editing, then be sure to check out the links in the description.